Meanwhile, the massive protests known as Moral Mondays that took place during this year's legislative session were back in the spotlight, as the Raleigh Police Department said. As a Christian conservative yourself, how do you square yourself with your running mate when these issues seem to keep coming up?
Playing up to people's faith is very important here in South Carolina, and from the voters we spoke to, they say it really does make a difference to them.
The high school graduation rate has risen by more than 17%, from 68% in 2004 and 5 to 86%. By the next time these fields are flourishing with tobacco products, this final payment will have already been made by the federal government. And for the farmers who work this land, they say a reduced payment is troubling.
This week has felt fairly predictable.
It has felt very predictable. Everybody knew that Hillary Clinton was probably coming away with the win here in South Carolina. She's always been up by a lot in the polls. Sanders did not do a lot to close that gap at all this week. He did very little campaigning.
Good evening, Loretta.
This is obviously a big issue this election season. It's often a big issue during the election season. In North Carolina, we've been talking about it a lot because of HB 2. And now we're seeing that
gathered some Republicans, Democrats, younger voters, older voters. We want to hear what the voters are actually thinking as we head into this vice presidential debate. We're going to start right now. When you come into the legislative building, there are rules posted as to what you are and are not allowed to do within the building and outside of the building. However, these rules have not been changed for several decades.
And there is a lot of interest in this election season. Early voting started here in North Carolina last Thursday. In the first 4 days, 160,000 people have cast their ballot. It took 11 days for that many people to cast their ballot during the last presidential election. In Raleigh, Loretta Boniti, Time Warner Cable News.
That is why this morning I have asked a federal court to clarify what the law actually is.
Governor Pat McCrory filed a suit this morning in federal court asking for a declaratory judgment. He says he believes the Department of Justice is misinterpreting federal law by saying that House Bill 2 is discriminatory and that now it is not only affecting North Carolina, but every state.
This is not just a North Carolina issue. This is now a national issue and an issue which imposes new law on every private sector employer throughout the United States of America with over 15 employees.
Later in the day, legislative leaders filed their own lawsuit. This suit is similar to the governor's, asking for clarification on Title VII, but also asks for additional clarification on Title IX, which could affect federal funding for education.
We believe the law says what it says, that sex means male and female. This recent interpretation by the Department of Justice is, by all accounts, unprecedented. It is redefining what Congress has always said this law meant. And so we're seeking clarification in the federal judiciary to know what do the federal courts say.
The ACLU, who has filed their own federal lawsuit against House Bill 2, says the state should have expected the federal government to say the law violates civil rights.
So the governor knew full well that this sort of response from the Department of Justice was forthcoming and did nothing to seek to rectify this situation by calling for the repeal of House Bill 2, and now has really, again, doubled down on discrimination.
Now, a couple things of note. The governor says he does believe that Congress needs to act to define discrimination under Title VII and Title IX. And also, while speaking to Speaker Moore today, he said, as far as this funding is concerned, he said, don't worry, the state is not going to go off the cliff. They understand how important this federal funding is, so if they do lose in court, he says you could maybe expect some action. However, he does say he believes that North Carolina will end up winning these courtroom battles. This is going to be a very big issue here. When you look at the number of evangelicals that there are here in South Carolina, it's higher than there were, obviously, in New Hampshire, even higher than there were in Iowa. So playing up to people's faith is very important here in South Carolina, and from the voters we spoke to, they say it really does make a difference to them.
From mentions on the campaign trail,
I try to share the same messages of hope, freedom, and faith in God that I was raised with.
Well, I think
to commercials, to preaching to the voters. When it comes to presidential politics, faith plays an important role. And now that the race has moved to the Bible Belt, that role is more prominent.
For a long time, I think it's been true that rather than being able to tout some church going, that you have a church or that you've voted in church going manner in the past, that you are able to talk about it in a genuine way, that you can convey a sense of sacred, that you hold certain things sacred.
Political observers say this could be a deciding factor in how the primary plays out on Saturday.
God bless the great state of South Carolina.
Observers note that Ted Cruz, who polling currently puts him in a tight race for second or third place in South Carolina, has made a big effort to rally the religious community.
And his ability to mobilize churchgoers in South Carolina may make the difference between him coming in second or third.
There is a reason for this emphasis on religion. According to Sabato's crystal ball, in the 24 binding primaries leading up to and including Super Tuesday on March 8th, 64% of the total delegates in play on the Republican side come from states where over half their electorate identifies as evangelical. Here in South Carolina, which has 50 delegates up for grabs, 64% of primary voters in 2012 were evangelical.
Because this is a rather than red, Obama referred to them as Bible clingers. They're not Bible clingers. These are people who have a deep faith in the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and they are not going to give that up. That's their foundation.
A Pew Research study conducted last month says that 2/3 of Republicans say it's important that a president share their religious beliefs. For a candidate like Ben Carson, he says his belief is strong.
Everybody is a person of faith. It's just a matter of what they put their faith in.
There is an argument to be made that faith does not play as big of a role as it used to in the South. But observers say even if it isn't as big, it will still sway the electorate.
As anyone will know, you've had people moving into North Carolina, moving into South Carolina, who are not necessarily identifying themselves as evangelicals or part of the Bible Belt. It's still predominant.
Now this year, if South Carolina and the GOP as a whole ends up nominating a candidate that doesn't necessarily hold all of these religious views, it's likely that the party as a whole will step in to make sure that these evangelical voices are heard.
And so the platform ends up being a lot more religious in nature.
The same cannot necessarily be said for the Democratic ticket. Faith is still important to voters, but perhaps would not change a voter's mind. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders aren't taking any chances. In fact, both spoke to the same congregation in Nevada over the weekend. Sanders has already made history this election season, being the first person of a Jewish faith to win a primary, having taken New Hampshire. And observers say while the push for the religious vote won't be as strong from the Democratic side, it will still be there.
You know, Loretta, it's going to be fascinating to watch this because the evangelical vote is so important in South Carolina, always has been, yet Donald Trump not really considered an evangelical candidate, and he's almost doubled up on Cruz and Rubio so far in the polls.
Well, that's right. That's why there is always that option of the platform. After the party chooses its nominee during the same convention where that happens, the party also votes on what its platform is going to be, what its issues are going to be. So what is common knowledge is if they actually end up picking a candidate who doesn't necessarily appeal to that evangelical voter, you will definitely see these issues in the party's platform.
Emotions were running high after a House committee voted against a proposal to allow medical marijuana in North Carolina.
This is unchristian. If he calls himself a man of God, I'll pray for him.
Rebecca Forbes' anger poured out, while for others it was tears as they watched their hopes for relief shot down.
We are not going to stand for this. You're not going to kill this bill.
Disease. I am not a criminal.
We want doctors.
None of us. I'm a taxpayer.
The Enact Medical Cannabis Act asked the state to distinguish between medical and non-medical marijuana usage, a proposal that the bill's sponsor says could not only help those patients seeking relief from the plant, but also could bring in some money for the state.
The tax and fee component would produce around $39 million per annum.
There was no debate by the committee leading up to the vote, but a clear majority of the House Rules Committee were against the measure in a voice vote, a decision applauded by some advocacy groups.
When you don't have a consensus among the medical community that this is really good for folks and that there's overwhelming evidence that marijuana is also damaging and harmful to health. There's not a compelling case.
But for those who suffer, they say this vote was a personal assault and one they won't take quietly.
I have children and grandchildren. I use this illegally in your state. And I'm very public. Rebecca Forbes, look me up, Google it.
Loretta Boniti, News 14, Carolina. The images from Charleston in June of last year are burned in the minds of the folks across South Carolina and the nation. Lives ended by another mass shooting.
We got too many gun deaths around the country.
For one state senator from Charleston, he says this is the wake-up call his state needed to change its gun laws.
The 5 bills that I filed on gun reform were a direct result of what happened.
This is a red state, a state where the line of Republicans being pro-guns and Democrats wanting more regulations is a bit blurred.
So it's a tight, kind of walk that both candidates are doing on the gun issue, where it may play in Charleston or even Columbia, not so much in the more rural parts of South Carolina.
We need comprehensive background checks.
But the candidates are talking about it.
And do everything we can to make sure no other family ever has to face the kind of tragic and terrible incident of gun violence that took the lives of those faithful worshipers at Mother Emanuel that day.
In fact, Clinton is using this as an issue to separate herself from Bernie Sanders. Sanders says he believes his record as tough on guns is clear.
We should not be selling military-style assault weapons. I have supported from day one an instant background check to make certain that people who should not have guns do not have guns.
The little .380s, the pocket guns.
But some gun rights advocates say they don't believe different gun laws could have stopped the Charleston tragedy.
What would gun laws do if he had chosen a chainsaw instead of a gun? The weapon is in the human mind.
But Kimpson says he wants change.
So that those lives that were lost, they would not have died in vain.
Loretta Boniti, Time Warner Cable News.
Seeds this tray with individual seeds.
Dudley Langdon is a 4th-generation tobacco farmer. For him, tobacco farming is a way of life, although it is a tough row to hoe.
My wife and I were married 30 years ago. We're in the same house, There's no bass boats, there's no motorcycles, there's no...
In 2004, the American Jobs Creation Act was signed off on by Congress. Part of the act was the Tobacco Transition Payment Program, commonly referred to as the tobacco buyout, where tobacco producers would get a 10-year payment to transition the market from a government price support program to a free market. That money is being paid by cigarette manufacturers, but now the U.S. Department of Agriculture says the final check will be smaller due to federal sequestration.
To me, it doesn't seem any rhyme or reason where the federal government can say that those funds are general obligation funds to the U.S. Treasury, therefore subject to a 7.5% cut.
Senator Kay Hagan and other members of Congress oppose this cut. They sent a letter to the USDA late last month saying the USDA has a responsibility to honor its commitment to our farmers and the financial institutions that securitize TTPP payments.
It's tantamount to a taking on the part of the federal government.
The North Carolina Farm Bureau agrees. They've joined forces with farmers, quota holders, and elected leaders to try to reverse this decision. But time is running out. By the next time these fields are flourishing with tobacco products, this final payment will have already been made by the federal government. And for the farmers who work this land, they say a reduced payment is troubling.
And if you've got a 40-acre farm and half of it's cropland, that's not a lot of income. So they are really dependent on this buyout money.
A concern shared by the approximately 98,000 folks in North Carolina that could see a smaller check than expected come January. Loretta Boniti, News 14, Carolina. You see the headlines, lives lost at the hand of another, arrests, trials, and in some cases, sentencing to death row. But in North Carolina, landing on death row might not mean you'll be executed.
We have not had an execution in North Carolina
since 2006, and we have the longest serving inmate on death row has been there since August 21 of 1985.
Due to legal wrangling over execution protocol and other things, North Carolina has a de facto moratorium on the death penalty, a delay that is tearing up some murder victim families.
Our police cars in Davie County came out with to serve and to protect. But I get an attitude every time I see that because I don't know who we're serving and I sure don't know who we're protecting.
The Howells lost their daughter 21 years ago. Her killer is still awaiting execution, a wait that could be even longer now because of a 4-year-old state law known as the Racial Justice Act. It allows death row inmates to challenge their sentence based on race. If they win their appeal, their death sentence would be commuted to a life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is exactly what happened in the case of Sergeant Ed Lowry's killer.
I don't care who killed my brother. I want justice served. And right now, the state has done everything but serve justice. And yes, I'm upset.
In all, 4 people have had their sentences overturned because of the Racial Justice Act. Now the state is on the verge of repealing the law, a step that some families say will help them or other families in their situation get the justice they want.
I don't think he held any remorse about what he did. The only thing he's doing now is laughing at the justice system. He's laughing.
Loretta Boniti, News 14, Carolina.